My oldest son called me at midnight. Working as a senior field agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he did not offer a greeting. He simply said, "Turn everything off. Go to the attic. Lock the door and do not tell your son-in-law." I whispered into the receiver that he was scaring me. He yelled back, demanding that I just do it. I followed his orders. Through a crack in the attic floorboards, I looked down into my own living room and saw something that made my blood run completely cold. My son-in-law was handing two armed strangers a map of my house and a forged power of attorney. Before I continue this story of how I systematically destroyed the man who tried to end my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a father's kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed a harsh red, displaying exactly midnight. I am William Gallagher, 65 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades calculating load-bearing walls and stress fractures. I built the very house I was sleeping in. I knew every nail, every beam, and every shadow. The vibration of my cell phone against the oak nightstand shattered the absolute silence of the room. It was not a gentle ring. It was an urgent, relentless buzzing. I reached out my joints, stiff from the evening chill, and grabbed the device. The screen illuminated my face in the dark. The caller ID displayed the name Matthew. Matthew is my oldest child. He does not call at midnight to chat about the weather. He is a senior field agent for the Financial Crimes and Racketeering Division. A midnight call from him meant a raid had gone wrong or someone was dead. I swiped the screen to answer, pressing the cold glass against my ear. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but Matthew cut me off instantly. His voice was completely stripped of its usual warmth. It was the voice of a federal agent issuing a direct command. He told me to get out of bed immediately. He instructed me not to turn on a single light. He told me to walk down the hall, pull down the attic stairs, climb up, and lock the heavy deadbolt we installed last winter. The most terrifying part of his instruction was the final sentence. He told me under no circumstances should I wake up or alert Bradley. Bradley is my daughter Rachel's husband. They moved into my house 6 months ago to save money for their own place. I sat up, the heavy cotton sheets pooling around my waist. The cold air of the room hit my chest. I asked Matthew what he was talking about. I kept my voice to a bare whisper. I told him he was scaring me. I told him Bradley was asleep in the guest room at the end of the hall. Matthew did not offer comfort. He raised his voice, a harsh, clipped yell that resonated through the tiny speaker. He commanded me to just do it, telling me that my life depended on my immediate compliance. He hung up. The line went dead. The silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My bare feet touched the cold, hardwood floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, pumping cold adrenaline through my veins. I did not question my son. I did not hesitate. I stood up in the pitch-black room. Navigating a house in total darkness requires absolute trust in your own memory. I built this structure. I knew that the floorboard just outside my bedroom door had a slight warp that would groan under my weight. I stepped carefully over it. The hallway was completely black, save for the faint moonlight, bleeding through the heavy curtains at the far end. The air felt unnaturally thick. I moved slowly, pressing my right hand against the textured wallpaper to guide my path. My breathing sounded deafening in my own ears. I forced myself to inhale slowly through my nose and exhale through my mouth, a trick I learned years ago to slow a racing pulse. I passed the guest bedroom. The door was closed. Rachel and Bradley were supposedly sleeping inside. I paused for a fraction of a second, listening for the sound of their breathing or the rustle of sheets. I heard absolutely nothing. I continued toward the end of the hall where the ceiling hatch to the attic was located. Reaching up, my fingers brushed the cold metal of the pull ring. I gripped it tightly. I knew the springs on this mechanism. If I pulled too fast, they would squeal. I applied steady, even pressure, bringing the wooden frame down millimeter by millimeter. It took an agonizing amount of time. My shoulders burned from the awkward angle, but the stairs descended in complete silence. I unfolded the wooden ladder. I climbed the first step. The wood was cold against my bare feet. I climbed the second, then the third. As I reached the top, I pulled my body into the dusty, insulation-filled space of the attic. I immediately turned around, grabbed the heavy wooden frame of the hatch, and pulled it up behind me. It snapped shut with a soft thud. I slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place, locking myself inside the roof of my own home. The darkness up here was absolute. The smell of old wood fiberglass insulation and trapped heat filled my lungs. I crawled forward on my hands and knees, feeling my way across the wooden joists. I knew exactly where I was going. When I designed the central ventilation system for this house, I installed a large decorative iron grate directly above the main living room to help circulate heat during the winter. I positioned my body flat against the attic floorboards, pressing my face against the cold iron of the grate. I looked down into my living room. The living room was bathed in the dim amber glow of a single floor lamp. I expected to see broken glass, overturned furniture, or masked home invaders holding my family hostage. What I saw instead paralyzed my lungs. My son-in-law Bradley was not tied to a chair. He was standing casually next to my custom-built mahogany liquor cabinet. He was wearing the expensive cashmere sweater I bought him for Christmas. He was holding my crystal decanter, calmly pouring my 30-year-old single malt scotch into 3 heavy glasses. Sitting on my expensive leather sofa were 2 men I had never seen before in my life. They were not wearing masks. They wore cheap, bulky leather jackets and dark jeans. One of them had a thick scar running along his jawline. The other was tapping a heavy silver lighter against the glass coffee table. Bradley handed the glasses to the men. He smiled. It was a relaxed, arrogant smile. I pressed my eye closer to the iron grate, straining to hear their voices echoing up through the high ceiling. The man with the scar took a sip of the scotch, grimaced, and placed the glass down. He told Bradley they were not there to socialize. He demanded the paperwork. Bradley nodded eagerly, setting his own drink down. He reached into his leather briefcase, which was sitting on my armchair, and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He spread them out on the glass coffee table. I recognized the blue architectural paper instantly. They were the blueprints to my house. The second document he produced had a gold notary seal on it. Bradley pointed at the blueprints. He told the men that my bedroom was on the ground floor at the end of the east hallway. He traced his finger along the floor plan, showing them the exact path from the sliding glass patio door directly to my bed. He then tapped the document with the gold seal. He proudly announced that it was a fully executed durable power of attorney. He bragged about how easy it was to forge my signature and bribe a desperate notary. He explained that once I suffered a tragic, fatal accident, he would have complete legal authority to liquidate my primary investment portfolio. He mentioned the 7-figure index funds I had spent 40 years building to secure my family's future. The man with the lighter stopped tapping it. He leaned forward, resting his heavy arms on his knees. He looked Bradley dead in the eye and said the accident would be handled smoothly, but it had to happen before Monday morning. He reminded Bradley that the syndicate boss was losing patience, and if the $500,000 gambling debt was not settled by Monday afternoon, Bradley would be the one having a tragic accident. I lay there in the dust, the cold iron biting into my cheek. The psychological horror washed over me like freezing water. My daughter's husband was not just a gambling addict. He was orchestrating my murder. He was selling my life to save his own, and he was doing it while drinking my scotch in the house I allowed him to live in. I did not cry. I did not gasp. The parental instinct to protect my daughter's husband evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, mathematical clarity. I was a structural engineer. I knew how to identify a fatal flaw in a foundation, and I knew how to demolish a structure safely. Bradley was the fatal flaw. The conversation in the living room shifted. The man with the scar stood up, towering over Bradley. He stated that they did not work on credit. He demanded a down payment of $20,000 in cash right now, or they would walk out the door and let the syndicate boss collect the debt from Bradley directly. Bradley held his hands up defensively. He told them to relax. He promised he had the money on hand. I watched my heart rate slowing to a steady, dangerous rhythm as Bradley walked away from the coffee table. He walked directly to the center of the living room. He knelt down on the large antique Persian rug that I had purchased in Istanbul 30 years ago. He rolled the heavy wool corner back, exposing the polished oak floorboards underneath. He pressed his thumb against a specific knot in the wood. A small square panel popped up, revealing the digital keypad of my hidden floor safe. The breath caught in my throat. I had installed that safe myself. I was the only person on Earth who knew the combination. Or so I thought. I watched Bradley's fingers dance across the keypad. He punched in the numbers without hesitation. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a solid thud. He pulled the thick door open. He reached inside and pulled out 4 thick banded stacks of $100 bills. It was $20,000. It was the emergency cash reserve I kept for absolute disasters. He tossed the money onto the coffee table. The scarred man picked up the stacks, thumbed through them quickly, and shoved them into the inner pocket of his leather jacket. He gave Bradley a curt nod. He told Bradley to make sure the sliding glass door was unlocked on Sunday night. He told Bradley to take his wife out to dinner and not to come back until after midnight. The two men turned and walked toward the front door. Bradley followed them, opening the heavy oak door and ushering them out into the night. I heard the lock click into place. Bradley stood alone in the living room for a moment. He looked down at the empty floor safe. He smiled to himself, a sickening look of sheer relief and arrogance. He closed the safe, rolled the Persian rug back into place, and walked down the hall toward the guest bedroom. The house fell completely silent again. I lay in the pitch-black attic, the dust settling around me. The immediate physical threat had left the building, but the true nightmare had just begun. I was locked in the roof of my own house, fully aware that I was sharing a roof with my own executioner. I had 48 hours until Sunday night. I had 2 days to dismantle Bradley's entire existence, protect my daughter, and shield my life's work from a criminal syndicate. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt purpose. The ticking clock had started, and I was going to use every single second to build a trap that Bradley Dunn would never see coming. The morning sun bled through the cracks in the attic roof, signaling the end of the longest night of my life. I had not slept a single second. My muscles ached from lying on the hard wooden planks, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. The initial shock of witnessing my son-in-law hire 2 men to orchestrate my murder had completely vanished, replaced by a cold and calculating focus. Today was Saturday. I had less than 48 hours before the hitmen returned to finish the job. I unbolted the heavy attic door and slowly lowered the wooden stairs. Every creak of the hinges felt like an alarm bell, but I knew Bradley was a heavy sleeper. I climbed down into the hallway, silently pushed the stairs back into the ceiling, and walked into my bedroom. I needed to wash the dust from my face and change my clothes. The man in the mirror looked exactly the same as he did yesterday, a tired 65-year-old retired engineer. That was my greatest advantage. I had to go downstairs and play the role of the oblivious father-in-law. I had to sit across from the man who sold my life and act completely normal. I adjusted my collar, took a deep breath to steady my racing heart, and opened my bedroom door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted up the main staircase. It was a domestic, comforting scent that felt entirely out of place in a house that had just become an active crime scene. I walked down the hardwood steps, placing my feet carefully to avoid the spots that squeaked. As I approached the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of a television playing a morning news broadcast. I stepped into the bright, sunlit kitchen. Bradley was sitting at the granite island. He was wearing an expensive silk robe that my daughter had bought for him using my credit card. He was casually scrolling through his smartphone, sipping coffee from my favorite ceramic mug. The sheer audacity of his relaxed posture made my stomach twist, but I forced my facial muscles to remain completely relaxed. I walked toward the coffee maker, giving him a polite morning greeting. He did not even look up from his screen. He simply grunted in response, his thumb aggressively swiping past articles about the stock market. I poured myself a cup of black coffee. The dark liquid looked bitter, perfectly matching the taste in my mouth. I leaned against the counter and watched him. I was looking at a man who believed he had won. He believed that by Monday I would be dead and he would be millions of dollars richer. He had no idea he was sitting across from the architect of his impending destruction. Bradley finally put his phone face down on the granite counter and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He looked around the kitchen with an expression of deep disgust. He told me the house was freezing. He complained that the thermostat was ancient and completely inefficient. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the hot liquid burn the back of my throat. I replied evenly that the heating system was checked last month and was working perfectly. I suggested he wear a sweater if he was cold. Bradley rolled his eyes, a gesture of profound disrespect that I had tolerated for years out of love for my daughter. He stated that a house of this size needed modern smart thermostats, adding that it was embarrassing to live in the past. He was criticizing the house he was living in for free, the same house he had handed the blueprints of to 2 contract killers just 8 hours ago. The dramatic irony was so thick it felt suffocating. I nodded slowly, telling him I would look into upgrading the system. My compliance seemed to feed his arrogance. He pushed his empty coffee mug toward the center of the island and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me with a sickening expression of false concern. He changed the subject abruptly, stating that the front yard was becoming an absolute eyesore. He told me that the grass was overgrown and the rose bushes my late wife planted were dying. He claimed that the neighbors were starting to stare and that it was affecting the property value. Property value. He was worried about the resale value of the home he planned to steal from my corpse. I kept my voice entirely neutral and asked him what he suggested we do about it. Bradley smiled, a thin, predatory stretch of his lips. He announced that he had taken the liberty of contacting a premium landscaping service in the area. He told me they could come out on Monday morning to completely redesign the front lawn, rip out the old roses, and install a modern stone pathway. He emphasized the words Monday morning, clearly relishing the secret knowledge that I would not be alive to see the landscapers arrive. He told me the service required an upfront payment of $5,000. He pulled a printed invoice from his robe pocket and slid it across the granite counter toward me. He casually mentioned that since I was the homeowner, I should be the one to cover the cost to protect my investment. I looked down at the piece of paper. It was a poorly fabricated invoice from a company I had never heard of. I knew instantly what this was. The $20,000 he stole from my floor safe last night was only a down payment. The syndicate needed more money, and Bradley was trying to squeeze every last dollar out of me before my scheduled execution. He was so confident in his plan that he was robbing me to my face disguised as a home improvement project. I reached out and picked up the paper. My hands did not shake. My heart rate remained steady. I looked at the exorbitant total at the bottom of the page. I looked back at Bradley. His eyes were wide with a feigned innocence that made me want to break his jaw. Instead, I carefully folded the invoice and placed it into the pocket of my slacks. I told him it was a very thoughtful idea. I thanked him for taking the initiative to care for the property. I promised him I would transfer the funds to his account by the end of the weekend so he could pay the workers on Monday. Bradley's smile widened into a genuine grin of pure greed and relief. He believed he had just effortlessly extracted another $5,000 from a foolish old man. He stood up from the stool, stretching his arms above his head, thoroughly satisfied with his morning performance. He told me he was going to take a shower and then head to the country club for a round of golf. He patted me condescendingly on the shoulder as he walked past me. I stood perfectly still, letting his hand touch my shirt. I watched him walk out of the kitchen and head up the stairs. The moment he was out of sight, I took the invoice out of my pocket and tore it into tiny, unrecognizable pieces, dropping them into the trash bin. The performance was over. I had successfully navigated the first interaction, but the real test was yet to come. I needed to get out of the house and meet with my son, but Bradley was not finished playing games. He was coming back downstairs, and I knew the next trap he laid would not be a piece of paper. It would be something far deadlier. I turned toward the hallway, intending to grab my heavy wool coat and leave the house. My plan was to drive to a secure location and meet my son to figure out our next move. My hand had barely touched the cold brass knob of the front door when I heard heavy footsteps descending the main staircase. I froze in place. Bradley was not going to the country club just yet. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs, fully dressed in his pristine white golf attire, holding a small silver foil packet in his right hand. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed my coat and my hand resting on the door. He asked where I was going in such a rush on a Saturday morning. I kept my grip firm on the brass knob and replied that I was just stepping out for a morning walk to get some fresh air. Bradley shook his head, a sickening, calculated smile returning to his face. He told me it was much too cold for a walk, and that a man of my advanced age needed to be extremely careful with his cardiovascular health. The sheer hypocrisy of the man actively plotting my murder, pretending to care about my heart, was almost suffocating. He stepped directly between me and the front door, effectively blocking my only physical exit from the house. He held up the shiny silver foil packet. He announced that he had bought a special imported herbal tea from an expensive boutique downtown. He insisted that it was fantastic for circulation and overall vitality. He told me he was going to brew me a fresh cup right now before he left for his golf game. I politely declined his offer. I told him I had already consumed enough black coffee for the morning and that my stomach was feeling a bit unsettled. Bradley did not move out of the way. His smile dropped by a fraction of an inch, revealing the cold, demanding predator hiding underneath the polished exterior. He insisted again, his voice dropping a full octave into a quiet command. He told me that he would not take no for an answer, emphasizing that he went completely out of his way to buy this expensive blend specifically for me. I realized in that exact moment that the tea was not a kind gesture. It was a calculated test, or perhaps something far worse. He needed me weak. He needed me pliable. He might even be trying to sedate me to ensure I stayed asleep in the house until his hired men returned to finish the job. I knew I had to play the game to survive. I let out a defeated sigh, removed my hand from the doorknob, and agreed to have a cup. I followed him back into the kitchen. The room that felt bright and open just 10 minutes ago now felt exactly like a concrete bunker. I sat heavily at the granite island, watching his every single move. He filled the electric kettle with tap water and clicked it on. He tore open the silver packet with his teeth. He deliberately did not let me see the printed label on the packaging. He placed the tea bag into a thick ceramic mug and poured the boiling water over it. He stood with his back to me for a few seconds too long. His shoulders shifted slightly in a suspicious motion. I could not see his hands. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I wondered if he was dropping a crushed pill into the water, a heavy sedative, a lethal dose of sleeping medication. I did not know the exact chemical makeup of the trap, but I knew with absolute certainty I could not drink whatever was brewing in that mug. He turned around and placed the steaming cup directly in front of my face. The liquid was a dark, muddy green color. It smelled faintly of bitter almonds and crushed wet weeds. He stood on the opposite side of the counters, leaning forward on his elbows, watching me with an intense, unblinking stare. He told me to drink it while it was hot. His posture made it abundantly clear he was not going to leave the house until he watched me swallow it. I reached out and wrapped my trembling fingers around the warm ceramic. I slowly brought the heavy mug to my lips. I let the hot steam hit the skin of my face. I needed an exit strategy, and I needed it immediately. As the thick edge of the cup touched my bottom lip, I inhaled sharply and deeply through my mouth. I forced the hot steam directly into my windpipe. The biological reaction was instantaneous and incredibly violent. I threw my head back and let out a harsh, barking cough. I deliberately loosened my grip on the mug. The hot tea sloshed over the rim, spilling onto my fingers and splashing aggressively across the pristine granite counter. I dropped the mug completely. It clattered loudly against the stone, spilling the entire remainder of the dark green liquid everywhere. I doubled over at the waist, clutching my chest with both hands, forcing out a second, even louder coughing fit. I hacked until my face turned completely red and my eyes watered heavily. Bradley jumped back in shock, startled by the sudden loud noise and the spreading liquid. He cursed angrily under his breath, frantically grabbing a white dish towel to wipe the hot tea off his expensive golf pants. I leaned heavily against the counter, panting loudly, keeping one hand firmly pressed against my chest. I apologized profusely between ragged fake gasps for air. I told him the hot steam had gone straight down the wrong pipe. I forced another deep, rattling cough from the very bottom of my lungs. I told him my chest was burning terribly and that I had been fighting off a severe chest cold all week. I staggered away from the spilled tea and moved quickly toward the kitchen sink. I turned on the cold water and splashed it generously onto my face, buying myself a few more precious seconds to solidify the performance. I turned back to Bradley, squinting through my watery, bloodshot eyes. I told him I needed to go to the local pharmacy immediately. I said I needed heavy prescription cough syrup and that I absolutely could not wait another minute. Bradley stared at me with pure disdain. He looked at the ruined puddle of tea, then back at my reddened, dripping face. The annoyance in his dark eyes was palpable. His perfect plan to sedate me had been completely ruined by a simple, uncontrollable biological reflex. He tossed the damp, stained dish towel onto the counter in absolute disgust. He told me to go get my medicine. He warned me to drive carefully, adding a highly sarcastic remark about my fragile physical condition. He turned his back on me and stormed angrily out of the kitchen, heading straight toward the garage. I listened closely as the heavy fire door slammed shut behind him. I listened to the loud engine of his sports car roar to life and reverse rapidly down the driveway. Only when the house was completely silent did I drop the act. I stopped coughing instantly. I stood up perfectly straight. I wiped the cold water from my face with my sleeve. I looked at the dark green puddle slowly dripping off the edge of the counter. I did not bother cleaning it up. I walked straight to the front door, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the freezing morning air. I had survived his morning trap, but my time was running out rapidly. I drove 3 towns over to an industrial park on the edge of the county line. The location was a dilapidated diner that catered mostly to long-haul truckers and shift workers. It was exactly the kind of place where men wearing expensive suits looked entirely out of place, which made it the perfect blind spot. I parked my car behind a row of rusted dumpsters. The cold morning wind bit through my wool coat as I walked toward the back entrance. I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped into a dimly lit back room that smelled of stale grease and black coffee. Matthew was already there. He was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth in the far corner. Sitting across from him was Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was my trust and estate attorney, a man known in legal circles for his absolute ruthlessness and surgical precision in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He was not a warm man, but warmth was not what I needed to survive the weekend. I needed a weapon, and Jonathan was a legal guillotine. I slid into the booth next to my son. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told them I had just survived an active attempt on my life involving a spiked cup of herbal tea. Matthew did not flinch. His jaw tightened, but his training kept his emotions completely locked down. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the sticky Formica table. He opened the cover, revealing a stack of transcribed audio logs and black and white surveillance photographs. I looked down at the top photograph. It showed Bradley walking out of a windowless warehouse in the meatpacking district, flanked by the same two men who had been standing in my living room just 9 hours ago. Matthew leaned forward, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. He explained that his division at the Bureau had been tracking a massive illegal sports betting syndicate for the past 14 months. The syndicate operated out of offshore servers but used local muscle to collect physical debts. Matthew told me they were running wiretaps on the top lieutenants of the organization. 3 weeks ago, a new name popped up on their audio recordings. The lieutenants were discussing a local real estate developer who had lost his entire liquid net worth betting on rigged collegiate basketball games. That developer was Bradley. Matthew pointed to a specific line of text on the transcribed audio log. He told me to read it. The transcript documented a phone call between the syndicate boss and the scarred man from my living room. The boss was demanding immediate payment of exactly $500,000. I stared at the number on the page. $500,000. I knew Bradley was arrogant, but I had no idea he was a degenerate gambler of this magnitude. Matthew continued his briefing. He explained that Bradley had begged the syndicate for an extension, claiming his wealthy father-in-law was going to experience a sudden, fatal heart attack over the weekend. Bradley had promised the syndicate that he would have total control of my entire estate by Monday morning, using the forged power of attorney to wire the funds directly into their offshore accounts. Matthew looked me directly in the eyes. He told me that when he heard my name on that federal wiretap at 11 o'clock last night, his blood ran cold. He had to mobilize an entire covert surveillance unit in less than an hour, which was why he called me at midnight and ordered me into the attic. He needed to verify the physical threat before he could authorize a tactical team to intervene. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I asked Matthew why he did not just kick my front door down last night and arrest everyone in the living room. It seemed like the most logical solution to an active murder plot. Jonathan Reed finally spoke up, answering the question before my son could. Jonathan adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and folded his hands neatly on the table. He told me that arresting Bradley right now would be the absolute worst tactical move we could make. Jonathan possessed a mind that viewed every human interaction as a complex game of chess, and he was always thinking 10 moves ahead. Jonathan explained the brutal reality of the situation. He told me that if the Bureau arrested Bradley today, the syndicate would immediately realize their $500,000 debt was gone. These were not men who simply wrote off bad loans. If they could not get the money from Bradley, they would look for the next closest target. That target was my daughter, Rachel. Jonathan stated clearly that Rachel was legally married to Bradley, and in the eyes of a ruthless criminal enterprise, a wife assumes the debts of her husband. Arresting Bradley would put an immediate target on my daughter's back. The syndicate would not hesitate to kidnap her, or worse, to force my hand. I sat back against the cracked vinyl seat. The absolute horror of the situation washed over me. Bradley had not just endangered my life. He had built a bomb and tied it directly to my daughter. Jonathan was not finished. He reached into his own leather briefcase and pulled out a second folder. This one was significantly thicker than Matthew's file. Jonathan placed it on the table and opened it. The documents inside were covered in official banking seals and electronic signatures. Jonathan looked at me with an expression of grim certainty. He told me the threat was not just physical. It was deeply financial, and Bradley had already pulled the trigger. Jonathan explained that Bradley had not just forged a power of attorney. He had spent the last 2 months systematically compromising my financial security to buy himself time with the syndicate. My heart hammered heavily in my chest. I asked Jonathan what he meant. Jonathan pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the top document. It was a property deed. He told me that Bradley had used the forged power of attorney, along with highly sophisticated electronic signature software, to take out a massive second mortgage on my house. The exact house I had built with my own hands. The house he was currently sleeping in. The amount of the fraudulent mortgage was exactly $500,000. Jonathan explained that Bradley had convinced a predatory offshore lender to approve the loan against the equity of my property. The money was scheduled to be disbursed on Monday afternoon. The trap was perfectly engineered. If I died this weekend, Bradley would use the forged documents to claim the loan money, pay off his gambling debts, and walk away clean, leaving my estate completely bankrupt. If I survived and tried to expose him to the police, the offshore lenders would still execute the second mortgage. They would foreclose on my house to recoup their money, leaving me homeless and my daughter at the mercy of the syndicate. I looked back and forth between my son and my attorney. I realized the true scope of the battlefield. This was not a simple home invasion. It was a sophisticated, multi-tiered siege on my entire existence. I could not simply run away, and I could not call the local police. I had to dismantle Bradley's financial leverage, protect my daughter, and destroy a federal crime syndicate simultaneously, all without alerting my son-in-law that I knew his secret. I looked down at the coffee mug on the table. My reflection stared back at me in the dark liquid. I was a structural engineer. I knew how to handle massive amounts of pressure. I looked up at Jonathan Reed. I told him we needed to sever the house from my name before Monday morning. I told him we needed to build a financial void so deep that when Bradley reached for the money, he would go completely into the abyss. Jonathan smiled for the first time. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. He pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his briefcase and told me that was exactly what he wanted to hear. The intelligence gathering was over. It was time to weaponize the information. Jonathan slid a thick stack of papers across the sticky surface of the diner table. I looked down at the top page. It was a loan agreement from a private equity firm I had never heard of before. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It looked absolutely perfect. Jonathan leaned in and told me that Bradley had not simply practiced my handwriting. He explained that my son-in-law had installed a keystroke logging program on my home office computer 2 months ago. Bradley had captured my passwords. He had bypassed my two-factor authentication by cloning my cell phone number to a secondary device. He used my own digital identity to apply for a $500,000 second mortgage on my house. He authorized the electronic signatures from an internet protocol address that traced directly back to my own living room. Jonathan stated that to any bank or legal entity looking at these files, I was the one who requested the money. I was the one who signed the contracts. I was the one legally responsible for the massive debt. I asked Jonathan who the lender was. He tapped a manicured finger against the logo at the top of the contract. He told me it was a shadow banking institution operating out of the Cayman Islands. They specialized in high-risk loans for people who needed liquid cash immediately and had massive assets to use as collateral. They did not ask questions. They did not require in-person meetings. They only required a pristine piece of real estate to place a lien against. My house was fully paid off. It was worth well over $2 million. It was the perfect target. Jonathan pointed to a date stamped at the bottom of the approval page. He told me the loan had cleared the final underwriting process yesterday afternoon. The funds were currently sitting in an escrow account. The money was scheduled to be disbursed directly into my primary checking account at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday. Bradley was planning to kill me on Sunday night, transfer the money to the syndicate on Monday morning, and walk away a wealthy man with a dead father-in-law. Matthew hit the table with his fist. He said he had enough evidence of wire fraud and identity theft to raid the house right now. He wanted to send a tactical team through the front door, drag Bradley out in handcuffs, and throw him in a federal holding cell. I looked at my son. I saw the anger of a child wanting to protect his father. I turned to Jonathan. I saw the cold calculation of a lawyer who knew that anger always loses to strategy. Jonathan shook his head slowly. He told Matthew that an immediate arrest was the absolute worst action we could take. He explained the brutal reality of the legal trap Bradley had inadvertently built. If the federal agents arrested Bradley today, the immediate physical threat to my life would be neutralized, but the financial devastation would be unstoppable. Jonathan laid out the sequence of events that would follow an arrest. The private equity firm in the Cayman Islands already possessed a legally binding contract with my verified electronic signature. If the Bureau took Bradley into custody, the story would inevitably leak. The shadow bank would immediately realize their loan was built on fraud. However, they would not simply cancel the transaction. They held a signed lien against my property. Jonathan explained that they would execute that lien instantly to protect their investment. They would initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings against my house. Because the digital evidence traced back to my own computer and my own internet connection, I would spend the next 5 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to prove I did not sign those papers. The bank would freeze all of my assets during the litigation. I would be locked out of my own accounts. I would lose the house I built. I would be left completely destitute in my final years, fighting a ghost corporation in international court. That was only the financial side of the trap. The physical threat was even worse. Jonathan looked at Matthew and reminded him of the syndicate. If Bradley went to federal prison today, his $500,000 gambling debt did not magically disappear. The men running the illegal betting ring did not care about wire fraud charges or federal raids. They only cared about their money. If their primary debtor was locked in a federal cell, they would immediately pivot to his next of kin to collect the funds. They would look at his marital status. They would see my daughter, Rachel. Jonathan stated with absolute certainty that the syndicate would target her by Monday night. They would threaten her, harass her, or perhaps do something far worse to force her to pay her husband's debts. Rachel was legally bound to Bradley. His liabilities were her liabilities in the eyes of a criminal organization. Arresting Bradley would essentially be handing my daughter over to the very men who were currently sitting in my living room plotting my murder. I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth. The diner suddenly felt incredibly cold. I felt the weight of my life's work and my family's safety pressing down on my chest. I thought about Rachel. She was living under my roof, entirely oblivious to the fact that her husband had placed a price tag on both of our heads. I wondered if she knew about his gambling. I wondered if she had noticed him sweating at night or hiding his phone. A part of me, the soft part of a father, wanted to believe she was completely innocent. But the cold, logical part of my brain, the engineer, knew that innocence did not matter when the structure was collapsing. The syndicate would not ask if she was complicit. They would only ask for the money. If I let Matthew arrest Bradley, I would lose my home to a shadow bank and lose my daughter to a criminal enterprise. The obvious solution was a fatal error. We were trapped in a room with a live explosive, and simply shooting the man holding the detonator would blow us all to pieces. I looked at the forged mortgage document one more time. The ink looked so permanent. The digital timestamps looked so official. Bradley had used the law as a weapon against me. He had used the banking system to build a cage around my life. I realized that the only way to defeat him was to use the exact same systems to build a deeper, darker void right underneath his feet. I looked up at Jonathan Reed. I told him we could not stop the loan from being dispersed, and we could not arrest Bradley before the money moved. We had to let Bradley think his plan was working perfectly. We had to let him reach for the money. But we needed to make sure that when he finally grabbed it, he was grabbing a live federal wire that would incinerate his entire life while leaving my assets completely untouched. Jonathan smiled, a very thin, very dangerous smile. He told me that I was finally thinking like a predator instead of prey. He reached into the very bottom of his leather briefcase. He pulled out a completely different set of documents. These were not forged. They were printed on heavy, high-quality legal paper bearing the official seal of his law firm. He placed them gently on the table. He told me that we were going to perform a legal amputation. He explained that we could not cancel the fraudulent mortgage but we could entirely remove the collateral it was attached to. He told me we were going to transfer the total ownership of my house, my investment portfolios, and all my liquid assets into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. We were going to do it today, right now, sitting in this diner. By the time Monday morning arrived, the man named William Gallagher would technically own absolutely nothing. The house would belong to a phantom entity. When the offshore bank tried to execute their lien, they would find themselves grabbing at thin air. The trap was going to be reversed. I listened closely as Jonathan explained the exact mechanics of the irrevocable blind trust. He stated that once my signature touched these new papers, I would surrender direct legal control of my entire estate to an independent trustee. In this case, the trustee would be Jonathan's own highly secure corporate entity. The beauty of this legal structure was its absolute finality. Once the assets were moved into the trust, they could not be seized by creditors. They could not be targeted by offshore banks. And they most certainly could not be accessed by a son-in-law with a forged power of attorney. Jonathan explained that the fraudulent second mortgage Bradley had taken out was tied directly to my personal Social Security number and my personal ownership of the deed. By legally erasing my ownership of the property 48 hours before the loan disbursement, we were effectively turning his massive financial weapon into a useless piece of paper. The offshore lender would try to finalize the lien on Monday, only to discover the asset they were lending against had completely vanished from the public registry. Matthew leaned forward, his eyes locked on the trust documents. He asked Jonathan how this protected Rachel from the syndicate. Jonathan replied that it was the second phase of the trap. Once my assets were completely shielded, we would let the $500,000 drop into my compromised checking account on Monday morning. We would let Bradley see the money. We would let him initiate the wire transfer to the syndicate to pay off his gambling debt. But because Matthew and his federal agents were currently monitoring that specific checking account, they would flag the transaction the exact second Bradley hit the send button. The money would be frozen in transit. Bradley would commit federal wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering in a single keystroke. The federal authorities would have him dead to rights on racketeering charges. The syndicate would never receive their money, but because Bradley would be facing decades in federal prison, he would be forced to turn state's evidence and testify against the entire illegal organization to save himself. Rachel would be protected by a wall of federal indictments. I reached across the sticky diner table and picked up Jonathan's expensive silver pen. I did not hesitate. I prepared to sign away everything I owned to save everything I loved. I took the heavy silver pen from Jonathan. The metal was cold against my fingers. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the sticky table of the diner. The title at the top of the first page read, Irrevocable Blind Trust Agreement. The paper was thick and textured, a sharp contrast to the greasy environment we were sitting in. Jonathan sat perfectly straight across from me, watching my eyes scan the dense legal terminology. He explained that what we were about to do was not just a transfer of assets. It was a complete legal amputation. He told me that by signing these pages, the entity known as William Gallagher would cease to own any physical property, any investment portfolios, and any liquid capital. Everything I had built over 40 years of grueling engineering work was about to be handed over to a corporate entity that existed only on paper. I asked Jonathan to walk me through the exact mechanics of the protection. I needed to understand the architecture of the trap before I armed it. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire life designing foundations that could withstand massive amounts of external pressure. Jonathan was designing a legal foundation, and I needed to know it would not crack. Jonathan leaned forward, speaking in a low, measured tone. He explained that the offshore lenders who approved Bradley's fraudulent second mortgage did so based on the current public records. Those records showed that I was the sole owner of the house. The lender placed a lien against my name and my property deed. Jonathan pointed to the second page of the document. He told me that this specific irrevocable trust was designed to act as a legal black hole. Once my assets crossed the event horizon of this trust, they could not be pulled back out by anyone, not even me, and certainly not by a shadow bank in the Cayman Islands. He explained that the trust would be managed by an independent corporate trustee stationed in a state with the most aggressive asset protection laws in the country. The moment I signed the paper, the deed to my house would be digitally transferred and legally recorded under the name of the trust. I looked at Matthew. My son was watching the exchange with intense focus. I told Jonathan that Bradley was expecting $500,000 to drop into my checking account on Monday morning, based on the forged mortgage. I asked what would happen when the offshore bank tried to finalize the lien against a house I no longer owned. Jonathan smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had just locked the cage from the outside. He explained that the shadow bank operated on automated digital systems. On Monday morning, their computers would disperse the funds into my compromised checking account as scheduled. However, when their legal department attempted to officially record the lien with the county clerk to secure their collateral, the system would reject it. The county records would show that William Gallagher did not own the property. The lien would be attached to a phantom entity. Jonathan continued his explanation, his voice filled with cold satisfaction. He stated that the offshore bank would instantly realize they had just wired $500,000 of unsecured funds to a fraudulent applicant. They would have no legal recourse to seize my house because the house belonged to an impenetrable trust created before their lien was ever finalized. The debt would remain entirely attached to the digital footprint Bradley used to secure the loan. Bradley would be left holding a massive unsecured debt to a furious international lending institution, and he would have absolutely no collateral to pay them back. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver washed over me. Bradley had tried to use the legal system to steal my life's work. We were using that exact same system to make my life's work completely invisible. I looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the last page. I thought about the sweat and blood I had poured into framing the walls of that house. I thought about the late nights I spent reviewing blueprints at the kitchen table to pay off the original mortgage. I was not giving my house away. I was pulling it out from under the feet of the man trying to hang me. I pressed the tip of the silver pen against the heavy paper. I signed my full legal name. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a dark, permanent trail across the page. I flipped to the next tab and signed again. I repeated the process 14 times, initialing every rider, every amendment, and every clause of the irrevocable trust. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a massive weight lifting off my shoulders. I was no longer a victim waiting for a hitman to arrive on Sunday night. I was the architect of my own survival. I was stripping the battlefield of all its resources before the enemy even knew the war had started. When I reached the final page, Jonathan pulled a small brass notary stamp from his briefcase. He pressed it firmly onto the paper, leaving a raised official seal next to my signature. He gathered the documents, tapped the edges against the table to align them perfectly, and slid them back into his leather folder. He looked at his stainless steel wristwatch. He announced that it was currently 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. He told me he was going to his office immediately to digitize the files and rush the transfer through the county clerk's emergency weekend processing system. He promised me that by noon today, the house would officially belong to the trust. Before leaving the booth, I asked Jonathan one final question. I asked how this trust protected my daughter Rachel from the syndicate's inevitable retaliation. Jonathan sat back down for a brief moment. He explained that the trust was designed with a specific provision regarding my descendants. If I were to pass away, the trust would not distribute lump sums of cash or property to Rachel, especially while she was legally bound to Bradley. Instead, it would distribute strictly controlled living allowances that could never be garnished by creditors, offshore banks, or criminal enterprises. Rachel would be financially secure, but Bradley would never be able to touch a single penny of the principal. The syndicate could threaten him all they wanted, but they would quickly realize the money was legally inaccessible. It was a financial fortress with walls too high for them to climb. Matthew added that the federal agents would be monitoring the syndicate's communications continuously. The moment the wire transfer was frozen on Monday, the syndicate would panic. They would likely contact Bradley to demand an explanation. Matthew assured me that his tactical team would intercept those communications, providing the final piece of evidence needed to arrest the syndicate bosses alongside Bradley. The legal amputation we just performed was the shield, and the pending wire fraud case was the sword. I looked at the empty spot on the table where the documents had been just moments ago. It was a profound realization. In the span of 30 minutes sitting in a decrepit roadside diner, I had legally vanished. William Gallagher, the millionaire homeowner, no longer existed. I was now just a tenant living in a property owned by an invisible corporate entity. Bradley had spent months plotting to murder a man for his wealth, completely unaware that the wealth had just evaporated into thin air. Jonathan picked up his briefcase, the brass clasps clicking shut with a final decisive sound. He gave me a firm handshake. His grip was strong and reassuring. He told me that the paperwork was the easy part. The hardest part was what I had to do next. I had to return to the lion's den. I had to look my would-be murderer in the eye and smile. I thanked Jonathan for his swift action. I turned to my son. Matthew did not offer a handshake. He pulled me into a tight embrace. It was the embrace of a son who had almost lost his father the night before. He whispered in my ear that he would have a surveillance van parked 3 blocks from my house for the rest of the weekend. He promised me I would not be alone in that house. I pulled away, giving him a firm nod. I turned and walked out the back door of the diner, stepping back out into the freezing wind. I walked to my car, my footsteps crunching on the frozen gravel. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. I did not turn the key immediately. I sat in the cold silence of the vehicle, letting the reality of the situation settle into my bones. The fear that had paralyzed me in the attic was completely gone. The anger that had burned in my chest during breakfast was extinguished. All that remained was cold procedural determination. The trap was set. The legal reversal was absolute. I started the engine, put the car in drive, and headed back to my house to prepare the poisoned bait. I pulled into the driveway of the house that no longer legally belonged to me. Bradley had already returned from his country club. His expensive silver sports car was parked aggressively in the center of the concrete, forcing me to park on the street. I turned off the engine and sat in the cold silence of my vehicle for a moment. The legal maneuver at the diner was complete, but a shield was not enough. I needed a sword. Now I had to execute the psychological warfare. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Matthew had given me this document right before I left the diner. It was a perfectly fabricated bank statement from my primary financial institution. It looked entirely authentic. It showed my name, my home address, and the routing numbers for the exact checking account that Bradley had already compromised. But the account balance was not normal. The paper displayed a recent and fully cleared deposit of exactly $2 million. Matthew had explained that this specific account was a federal honeypot. It was a digital cage monitored heavily by the Cybercrimes Division. The money did not actually exist, but to anyone logging into the banking portal, it looked like a massive liquid fortune sitting completely unprotected. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground. I heard the faint sound of a television playing a sports channel in the upstairs master bedroom. Bradley was resting. I took off my coat and walked deliberately down the hallway toward my home office. This room was my absolute sanctuary. It was where I drafted the blueprints for my engineering firm. It was where I paid for my daughter's college education. Now I knew Bradley had been sneaking in here for months to steal my passwords and forge my signature. I pushed the heavy oak door open and walked over to my mahogany desk. The art of setting a trap is making the prey believe they discovered it entirely by accident. If I left the bank statement sitting perfectly centered on the leather blotter, Bradley would suspect a setup. I had to make it look like the careless mistake of a tired, terrified old man. I pulled a stack of unpaid utility bills and old medical records from my drawer. I spread them out randomly across the desk. I slid the fabricated bank statement near the bottom of the messy pile, leaving only the top third of the page visible. The massive $2 million balance was hidden from plain sight, but the bold black letters of the bank logo and the account number were clearly exposed. It was just enough to catch the eye of a greedy man looking for his next score. I left my leather desk chair pulled out slightly to make the room look recently occupied. I left the office door cracked open exactly 3 inches. I walked out of the room and headed toward the kitchen. I needed to let Bradley know I was back in the house, but I also needed to give him a clear opportunity to snoop. I deliberately slammed the heavy refrigerator door shut. The loud thud echoed through the silent house. I immediately heard the television upstairs go quiet. Footsteps moved across the ceiling above me. Bradley was coming to investigate the noise. I quickly moved out of the kitchen and stepped into the shadowy alcove beneath the main staircase. It was a blind spot that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the hallway leading to my office. I held my breath and waited in the dark. Less than a minute later, Bradley appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He was still wearing his pristine white golf attire. He looked around the empty living room, his eyes scanning for my presence. He called out my name, his voice dripping with a sickening, fake concern. I remained completely silent, pressing my back flat against the cool plaster wall. Receiving no answer, Bradley assumed I was in the garage or had gone down into the basement. He did not go back upstairs to his television program. Instead, he walked straight down the hallway toward my office. He moved quickly and silently on the tips of his toes. It was the complete opposite of his usual heavy, arrogant footsteps. He reached the cracked door of my sanctuary. He paused for a fraction of a second, checking over his shoulder one last time to ensure he was alone. Then he slipped inside the room like a thief. I leaned forward slightly, peering through the narrow gap in the door hinge. I could see the side of his face and the surface of my desk. Bradley immediately began rifling through the papers I had left out. He moved the utility bills aside with annoyed precision, searching for anything valuable. Then his hands stopped completely. He had found the bait. I watched him pull the fabricated bank statement out from under the pile. He brought the paper closer to his face. I could not see his eyes, but I saw his entire body go rigid. The realization of the $2 million balance hit him like a physical blow. His breathing became heavy and audible, echoing slightly in the quiet room. Bradley did not just look at the paper. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket. His hands were shaking violently with pure adrenaline and unchecked greed. He opened his camera application and took 3 rapid pictures of the document, ensuring he captured the account number and the routing details perfectly. He thought he had just stumbled upon his ultimate salvation. He believed that waiting for the $500,000 loan on Monday was no longer necessary if he could simply drain this massive account before Sunday night. The syndicate debt was suddenly a minor inconvenience compared to the absolute fortune sitting right in front of him. He carefully slid the paper back into the exact position he found it, covering it with the utility bills so I would never know it had been touched. He stepped back from the desk, letting out a low, victorious laugh. It was a sound of absolute arrogance. He turned and walked out of the office, pulling the door shut behind him. He practically sprinted back up the stairs, eager to begin his digital theft. I stepped out of the shadows beneath the staircase. My heart beat with a steady, triumphant rhythm. The legal reversal had severed his power, and the poisoned bait had just sealed his fate. He was going to initiate a massive wire transfer today, and when he did, he would be pulling the lever on his own federal trap. I walked away from the staircase and headed toward the kitchen. I needed to know the truth about my daughter. I needed to know if Rachel was an innocent victim of her husband's massive gambling addiction, or a willing participant in my financial execution. I found her sitting at the large granite island that I had installed myself just 5 years ago. She was holding a thick stack of glossy home improvement magazines and a heavy metal ring of expensive paint swatches. She was sipping a glass of imported sparkling water, completely absorbed in her planning. I walked over and sat on the wooden stool next to her. She barely acknowledged my presence. She pushed a small cardboard paint swatch toward me, pointing her perfectly manicured finger to a pale gray color. She told me she and Bradley had decided to repaint the entire first floor next month. She stated confidently that my current color choices were terribly outdated and incredibly depressing to look at. She was casually planning the expensive renovation of my own home, while her husband was upstairs stealing my money to pay his contract killers. I looked at the small square of gray cardboard on the granite counter. I kept my posture relaxed and my voice incredibly calm. I told her I had been doing some serious thinking this morning about the future. I told her that reaching my age makes a man evaluate his legacy and the impact he leaves behind on the world. Rachel did not look up from her magazine. She gave a highly dismissive hum, clearly uninterested in my philosophical thoughts. I continued speaking smoothly. I told her I had scheduled a meeting with Jonathan Reed to restructure my last will and testament. That specific sentence finally grabbed her attention. She stopped flipping the glossy pages and turned her head to look at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly in suspicion. She asked me what exactly I meant by restructuring. I explained my reasoning methodically. I reminded her that I had provided for her entirely during her childhood and paid for her expensive university degree in full so she would graduate without a single dollar of debt. I told her she was a healthy, capable adult, married to a man who constantly claimed to be a highly successful real estate developer. I stated that because they were so independent and doing so well, they had decided to leave the house and my primary investment portfolios to a charitable foundation. I told her I wanted to create a permanent scholarship fund for underprivileged youth who desperately wanted to study structural engineering but could not afford the tuition. I told her it felt like the most honorable thing to do with my life's work. The silence that followed my statement was heavy and deeply toxic. Rachel stared at me as if I had just struck her across the face. The thin mask of the loving daughter melted away instantly, replaced by a vicious, twisted expression of pure entitlement. She slammed her hand down violently on the granite counter. The sudden noise echoed sharply in the large kitchen. She demanded to know if I was losing my mind. Her voice rose into a shrill, aggressive tone that I had never heard her use before. She told me I had absolutely no right to give away her inheritance to a bunch of ungrateful strangers. She emphasized the word "her" as if the money I had earned through 40 years of grueling physical labor belonged inherently to her simply because she existed in my bloodline. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I asked her why she was so incredibly upset over money she supposedly did not need. I reminded her that Bradley was doing very well financially, and that they were only living here temporarily to save for a luxury property of their own. That statement pushed her completely over the edge of rationality. Her face turned pale with a furious, desperate energy. She leaned aggressively across the counter, invading my personal space. She yelled that Bradley was under an immense amount of pressure at work. She claimed that Bradley worked significantly harder than I ever did, and that the real estate market was completely unpredictable and unfair right now. She told me that Bradley deserved a break, and that my money was supposed to be their guaranteed safety net. She did not stop there. She pointed her finger directly at my chest. She told me I was being incredibly selfish and delusional. She listed every single grievance she had ever harbored against me since her childhood. She complained that I had always cared more about my architectural blueprints and construction sites than my own family. She stated that giving the house to charity was just another pathetic way for me to feed my own ego instead of taking care of my own flesh and blood. She looked around the kitchen, waving her hands wildly at the custom cabinets and the stainless steel appliances. She explicitly stated that this house was practically theirs anyway, She told me that I was an old man living completely alone in a space that was far too large for my basic needs. She proudly revealed that Bradley had already drawn up architectural plans to convert my home office into a nursery and my ground floor bedroom into a master suite for themselves. Every single venomous word she spoke was a heavy nail in the coffin of my paternal guilt. I sat perfectly still and let her unleash her true nature. I did not interrupt her tirade. I did not defend myself against her cruel accusations. I just listened to the absolute greed pouring out of my own daughter's mouth. I was searching her face for a single shred of genuine empathy. I was waiting for her to express even a minor concern for my health, my happiness, or my legacy. There was absolutely nothing. She did not view me as a father or a human being. She viewed me solely as an expired resource. She viewed me as a stubborn obstacle standing directly between her husband and my bank accounts. She was fiercely defending the very man who had just sold my life to a criminal syndicate, all because she wanted a newly painted house and an easy life funded by my death. Rachel finally stopped yelling. She stood there panting heavily, her chest heaving with misplaced indignation. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and glared at me with absolute contempt. She demanded that I cancel my meeting with Jonathan Reed immediately. She ordered me to leave the will exactly as it was, with her legally named as the sole beneficiary and the primary executor of the entire estate. She threatened that if I gave the money to charity, she and Bradley would pack their bags and move out today, and I would die completely alone. She thought the threat of loneliness would force me to surrender immediately. She genuinely believed she was holding the ultimate emotional leverage over a frail, desperate old man. She had absolutely no idea that I had already signed the irrevocable trust hours ago. She had no idea the massive fortune she was screaming about no longer existed in my name. I looked at her face desperately searching for the little girl I used to take to the park on Sunday afternoons. That little girl was completely dead and gone. The woman standing in front of me was a greedy parasite. My heart did not break in that profound moment of realization. It hardened into solid, impenetrable ice. The final cord of familial obligation snapped clean in two. I felt an incredible sense of emotional detachment wash over my entire body. I was completely free from the burden of loving her. I stood up slowly from the kitchen stool. I looked her directly in the angry eyes. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any parental warmth. I told her I understood her position completely. I told her she had made her true priorities very clear to me today. I did not argue with her demands. I did not yell back at her threats. I simply turned my back on her and walked calmly out of the kitchen. I walked steadily down the hallway, leaving her standing alone with her worthless paint swatches and her empty ultimatums. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and typed a brief, highly direct text message to Jonathan Reed. I instructed my lawyer to immediately draft the legal paperwork to formally strip Rachel from any remaining executor duties on my medical directives and end-of-life planning. I hit send. The familial betrayal was finally complete, but my conscience was entirely clear. I no longer had a daughter to protect. I only had an enemy to destroy, and the final stage of the federal trap was about to activate. I walked into my ground floor bedroom and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I deliberately chose not to lock it. I needed to maintain the complete illusion of vulnerability in my own home. I sat on the edge of my mattress, staring down at the blank screen of my cell phone. The bitter confrontation with Rachel in the kitchen was over. The emotional ties were completely severed, leaving behind a cold, empty space in my chest. Now there was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the digital snare to snap shut. The house was deceptively quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant sound of a delivery truck driving down the street. Upstairs, directly above my ceiling, the silence was broken by the rapid, heavy footsteps of my son-in-law pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor of the guest bedroom. Bradley was a man entirely consumed by sudden, overwhelming greed. He had seen the fabricated bank statement sitting on my desk. He truly believed he had just discovered $2 million of completely unprotected liquid cash. He was no longer thinking about the complicated $500,000 offshore loan scheduled for Monday. He was no longer thinking rationally at all. Greed is a highly effective poison because it completely blinds its victim to obvious danger. He reasoned that waiting for a complex real estate transaction was foolish, when he could simply drain the old man's checking account right now. That was the exact psychological weakness Matthew and I were counting on. My cell phone vibrated violently against my palm, startling me slightly. The screen illuminated the dark room. It was a secure text message from my son. The message contained only 4 words. He is logging in. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. Miles away in a highly secure federal building, Matthew and his cybercrimes team were watching Bradley's digital footprint in real time. Bradley had used the passwords he stole from my computer to access the federal honeypot account. I imagined him staring at his screen, completely mesmerized by the confirmation of a $2 million balance. I could almost picture his shaking hands as he furiously navigated the banking portal. He was typing in the offshore routing numbers provided to him by the illegal gambling syndicate. He was attempting to wire the entire sum, hoping to pay off his massive debt and keep $1.5 million for himself to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was attempting to steal my life savings with a single keystroke. I waited in the silence of my bedroom, counting my own heartbeats. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. I watched the plaster ceiling, listening to the frantic pacing upstairs. Then the footsteps stopped completely. There was a moment of absolute terrifying stillness in the house. My phone vibrated a second time. Another text from Matthew appeared on the glowing screen. Transfer initiated. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs completely. The poisoned bait had been swallowed. Bradley had just committed felony wire fraud across state lines. He had crossed the point of no return. But the trap was not finished closing yet. A third text message arrived just 10 seconds later. Transfer frozen. Account locked. Federal flag activated. The snare had officially snapped completely shut on his leg. The $2 million never moved. The federal banking system automatically flagged the massive transaction as highly suspicious and completely locked the account down. Bradley was now permanently locked out of the system. The sudden silence upstairs was violently broken. I heard a loud, muffled shout of pure panic echo through the floorboards. I heard the sound of something heavy, perhaps a wooden chair or a heavy brass lamp being thrown aggressively against the wall. The illusion of his guaranteed wealth had just evaporated into thin air in front of his eyes. He was suddenly right back where he started, but in an infinitely worse position. He had just alerted the banking authorities to a massive fraudulent wire transfer, attempting to hit an offshore account known for illegal gambling. The syndicate was monitoring their receiving accounts closely, waiting for his payment to clear. When the federal freeze hit the transaction, it sent an immediate red flag directly to the syndicate bosses. They realized instantly that the money was stopped by federal authorities. They realized their own receiving accounts were now potentially exposed to a massive federal investigation. My phone vibrated a 4th time. This time it was not a text message. It was a secure audio file. Matthew had intercepted an incoming phone call to Bradley's cell phone using the active federal wiretap. I pressed play and held the speaker close to my ear. I heard Bradley's voice first. He was breathing heavily, his voice trembling with absolute terror. He was begging the man on the other end of the line to give him another chance. He was frantically explaining that the bank must have placed a temporary security hold on the account because of the unusually large amount. He swore he could fix the problem by Monday morning. Then I heard the second voice. It was the same scarred man who had been standing in my living room the night before. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He did not yell. He spoke with a chilling, quiet authority that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The scarred man told Bradley that the frozen transfer had just put the entire organization at severe risk. He told Bradley that they no longer trusted his empty promises. They no longer believed he had the situation under control. The syndicate boss had lost all patience with his sloppy methods. The timeline was no longer Monday morning. The timeline was no longer Sunday night. The scarred man delivered the final fatal ultimatum. He told Bradley that the accident needed to happen tonight. He stated clearly that his fixers were coming to the house tonight at exactly 9 o'clock. If the old man was not dead and the money was not secured by midnight, they were going to kill Bradley and his wife instead. He promised to make it slow and incredibly painful. The call disconnected abruptly. The audio file ended, leaving me in the silent room. I sat in the dim light of my bedroom, the extreme gravity of the new timeline settling over me like a heavy blanket. The trap had worked perfectly. It had forced the enemy into a state of absolute panic. It had forced them to make a massive mistake and accelerate their plans drastically. However, it also meant I had run out of time. Today was Friday. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. It was currently 3 in the afternoon. I had exactly 6 hours before armed killers walked through my front door. The waiting period was officially over. The decisive confrontation was arriving tonight. I stood up from my bed, my mind crystal clear. I needed to prepare the dining room. I needed to prepare myself to look evil directly in the eye and watch it destroy itself. The smell of seared steak and roasted garlic drifted heavily down the hallway, masking the underlying scent of absolute panic that had infected my home. I checked the heavy silver watch on my wrist. It was exactly 7 in the evening. I had spent the last few hours resting in my bedroom, conserving my physical energy for the violence that was undoubtedly coming. Now it was time to face the man who had orchestrated it. I walked out of my room and headed toward the kitchen, my footsteps slow and deliberate on the hardwood floor. I stopped at the threshold of the kitchen archway and observed my son-in-law before making my presence known. The arrogant, polished real estate developer from this morning was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, cornered animal. Bradley was frantically moving between the stainless steel stove and the granite island. He was still wearing his white golf pants, but they were now stained with cooking oil and dark spots of spilled wine. His expensive silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, completely soaked with nervous sweat. His hands shook visibly as he aggressively flipped a heavy piece of meat in the cast-iron skillet. He was breathing through his mouth in short, ragged gasps. The frozen wire transfer had completely broken his psychological foundation. He was a man out of time, desperately trying to sedate me before his hired killers arrived at 9 o'clock. I stepped fully into the kitchen and cleared my throat. Bradley jumped violently, nearly dropping the heavy metal spatula onto the floor. He spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his chest heaving. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, as if he had seen a ghost. I kept my posture completely relaxed. I offered him a warm, oblivious smile and commented on how wonderful the food smelled. I asked him what had inspired him to cook such an elaborate dinner on a Friday night. Bradley forced a smile onto his face, but it was a grotesque, trembling imitation of happiness. He wiped his sweaty forehead with the back of his arm and stammered through a clearly rehearsed lie. He claimed he wanted to do something nice to apologize for his abrasive behavior this morning. He said that the stress of the real estate market had been getting to him, but he had just received some excellent news regarding a major investment, and he wanted to celebrate. I knew the excellent news he was referring to was his delusion of draining my bank account, a delusion that had just ended in a catastrophic federal freeze. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the forgiving father-in-law perfectly. I walked over to the granite island and sat down on the wooden stool directly across from him. Sitting on the counter between us were 2 large crystal wine glasses and an expensive bottle of dark red Cabernet. One glass was already poured, filled nearly to the brim. The other glass was completely empty. Bradley picked up the heavy glass bottle. His hands were shaking so severely that the neck of the bottle rattled loudly against the crystal rim of the empty glass as he poured a second serving. He set the bottle down and pushed the newly poured glass across the smooth granite surface toward me. The dark red liquid sloshed dangerously close to the edge. He looked me right in the eyes, a desperate, unnatural intensity burning in his expression. He told me I needed to drink this specific wine. He insisted it was a highly exclusive vintage he had been saving for a special occasion. He stated that it would help me relax and sleep peacefully through the night. The implication was entirely clear. The glass he had just poured for me was heavily laced with a potent sedative. He needed me unconscious when the syndicate men broke through the back door. He needed to hand over my sleeping body to save his own life. I looked down at the dark red liquid in the crystal glass. I did not touch it immediately. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool granite. I looked back up at Bradley. I told him I was surprised to see him in such a celebratory mood. I casually mentioned that I thought I heard him yelling upstairs earlier this afternoon. I asked him if everything was all right with his business partners. The question hit him like a physical blow. He froze completely. The color drained entirely from his already pale face. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He quickly broke eye contact and turned his attention back to the stove. He aggressively scraped the spatula across the bottom of the hot pan, creating a loud screeching noise that filled the room. He told me it was just a minor miscommunication with a difficult contractor. He insisted that everything was perfectly under control now. His voice was pitched an octave higher than normal. He was lying, and he knew that I was watching him lie, but his sheer desperation blinded him to my strategy. He turned back around and pointed a trembling finger at the wine glass sitting in front of me. He demanded that I drink it. He said it was an insult to his hospitality if I refused to share a toast with him. I needed to make the switch, but I needed him to turn his back on me for exactly 3 seconds. I knew that arguing with him would only escalate his panic. I smiled gently and wrapped my right hand around the stem of the poisoned glass. I told him I would gladly drink to his success. I raised the glass slightly into the air, but right before the rim touched my lips, I suddenly widened my eyes and pointed directly at the stove behind him. I raised my voice in sudden alarm. I told him the grease in the skillet was catching fire. The immediate threat of a kitchen fire overrode his focus on the wine. Bradley cursed loudly and spun around instantly, grabbing a thick kitchen towel to smother the imaginary flames. He leaned over the stove, completely blocking his own line of sight to the granite island. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. My movements were born of 40 years of precise structural engineering. I smoothly slid the poisoned glass across the counter toward his empty spot. In the exact same fluid motion, I grabbed his untainted glass of wine and pulled it directly in front of my own chest. The switch was completely silent and flawlessly executed. Bradley turned back around, panting heavily. He looked confused and intensely frustrated. He told me there was no fire. He said the pan was just smoking slightly because the heat was too high. I offered a sheepish, apologetic smile. I told him my eyesight was not what it used to be and that I was just trying to help. He let out a harsh breath of sheer annoyance. He walked back to his side of the island and immediately grabbed the crystal glass sitting there. He did not notice the slight difference in the liquid level. He was entirely consumed by the ticking clock in his head. He lifted his glass high into the air. He stared at me with a cold, dead expression. He offered a chilling toast. He said we should drink to the future and to peaceful endings. I raised my untainted glass to meet his. I looked directly into the eyes of my would-be murderer and repeated his words perfectly. I drank to peaceful endings. We both brought the heavy crystal rims to our lips. I took a slow, deep swallow of the dark red Cabernet. It was rich and completely clean. I watched closely as Bradley tilted his head back and drank nearly half of his own glass in one desperate gulp. He swallowed the potent sedative without a single ounce of hesitation. He slammed his glass back down onto the granite counter. He let out a long sigh, expecting me to immediately show signs of extreme fatigue. He stood there, leaning heavily against the counter, waiting for my eyelids to droop. I simply sat there watching him with absolute unblinking clarity. 5 minutes passed in agonizing silence. The meat sizzled loudly in the skillet behind him. Bradley furrowed his brow. He looked at my face, then down at my half-empty glass, and then back up at me. Confusion began to creep into his panicked features. Then the biological reality of his mistake hit him. The heavy sedative entered his bloodstream with brutal efficiency. I watched the exact moment his central nervous system began to shut down. His knees buckled slightly, causing him to grip the edge of the granite counter with both hands to keep himself upright. He blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to maintain focus on my face. His breathing slowed from rapid gasps to deep lethargic pulls of air. He opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw muscles were completely relaxed. The words came out as a thick, unintelligible slur. He asked me what was happening to him. I did not move from my stool. I kept my voice entirely calm and mathematically precise. I told him that he looked incredibly tired. I told him that the stress of stealing $2 million from a federal honeypot account must have completely exhausted him. The words penetrated the thick fog of his sedated mind. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the realization finally crashed over him. He knew that I knew. He realized that the trap he thought he was building had actually been built around him. He tried to push himself away from the counter to attack me, or perhaps to run away. His arms completely betrayed him. They buckled under his own weight. Bradley collapsed forward. His chin slammed hard against the solid granite surface. His eyes rolled back into his head. His entire body went completely limp, sliding off the edge of the counter and crashing heavily onto the hardwood floor of the kitchen. He lay there in a crumpled, pathetic heap, deeply unconscious. I stood up slowly from my stool. I walked around the island and looked down at the man who had sold my life for $500,000. He was breathing steadily, but he would not wake up for at least 12 hours. I stepped over his unconscious body and walked over to the stove. I calmly turned off the burner, removed the hot skillet from the heat, and turned off the kitchen lights. I walked into the dark dining room to wait. The false threat was neutralized. The real threat was arriving in less than 20 minutes. I sat in the heavy mahogany chair at the head of the dining table. The digital clock on the microwave in the adjacent kitchen displayed 8:55. The house was entombed in absolute darkness. I had closed all the heavy curtains earlier in the evening, plunging the interior into pitch black. The only sound in the entire house was the deep, rhythmic breathing of my son-in-law lying unconscious on the hardwood floor, just a few feet away. I rested my hands flat on the smooth, polished surface of the table. My palms were completely dry. I was not afraid. I was a structural engineer waiting to test the maximum load capacity of the trap I had built. I had spent my life calculating the breaking points of steel and concrete, and now I was calculating the breaking point of human greed. The minutes crawled forward with agonizing slowness. At exactly 9 o'clock, the wind outside seemed to completely die down. The silence became thick and highly oppressive. Then I heard it. It was a sound so faint that a normal person sleeping in their bed would never have noticed it. It was the soft crunch of rubber soles stepping onto the frozen gravel of the back alleyway. There were 2 sets of footsteps. They moved with practiced military precision. One footstep was followed by a long pause, then another. They were approaching the heavy sliding glass patio door that connected the backyard directly to the kitchen. The physical reality of the threat had finally arrived at my doorstep. I remained perfectly still in the dark dining room, I controlled my breathing, inhaling through my nose and exhaling slowly through my mouth to suppress any sound. I listened intently as the men reached the patio door. Bradley had promised them he would leave it unlocked for an easy entry. However, I had engaged the secondary steel deadbolt that I installed myself at the base of the frame. I wanted to force them to break in. I wanted the physical evidence of a forced entry to completely cement the federal charges against the syndicate. I heard the metal handle rattle slightly in the dark. When the door did not slide open, the men did not panic or walk away. They were cold professionals executing a paid contract. A moment later, I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a glass cutter scoring the thick pane of the patio door. It sounded like a diamond dragging slowly across ice. This was followed by a dull thud as they applied direct pressure to snap the glass. A suction cup was likely used to remove the broken piece, silently preventing it from shattering loudly on the concrete patio. I heard the quiet click of a gloved hand reaching through the newly created hole to disengage the heavy steel deadbolt. The patio door slid open on its metal tracks with a soft rolling hum. The freezing night air instantly poured into the warm kitchen, bringing with it the metallic smell of wet asphalt and impending violence. They stepped inside my home. I could hear the faint squeak of their heavy leather jackets as they moved through the doorway. A narrow beam of blue light cut through the pitch-black room. They were using a tactical flashlight with a color filter to preserve their night vision. The beam swept methodically across the kitchen counters, illuminating the stainless steel appliances and the abandoned cast-iron skillet still sitting on the stove. The light moved down the cabinets and traced along the floorboards. It stopped abruptly. The blue beam focused entirely on the crumpled, unconscious body of Bradley lying motionless on the kitchen floor. The two men froze in their tracks. I heard one of them whisper a harsh curse under his breath. This was completely outside the parameters of their plan. Bradley was supposed to be at a fancy restaurant across town, with my daughter establishing his alibi. The hitmen expected a completely empty house with the sleeping old man completely alone in the master bedroom. Instead, they found their employer passed out on the floor like a discarded rag doll. The scarred man tapped his partner firmly on the shoulder. I heard the distinct heavy metallic click of a handgun being cocked. The situation had just escalated from a silent assassination to an active, unpredictable breach. They did not know if Bradley was dead or simply asleep. They did not know if the police were already on their way. The second man knelt beside Bradley. I could hear the rough fabric of his jeans rustling against the wood. He pressed his fingers against Bradley's neck to check for a pulse. Finding a strong, steady heartbeat, he stood back up and whispered that the idiot was just heavily sedated. The scarred man let out a low breath of pure disgust. He whispered back that they needed to finish the contract immediately and get out of the house before the situation deteriorated any further. They stepped completely over Bradley, their heavy combat boots narrowly missing his fingers. They moved away from the kitchen and entered the wide archway leading toward the dining room. To reach the hallway that led to my ground floor bedroom, they had to walk directly through the open space of the dining room where I was sitting. They moved with absolute stealth, placing their feet carefully on the edges of the floorboards to avoid making the wood creak. The blue beam of the tactical flashlight swept back and forth across the walls, checking the corners and blind spots for any hidden threats. I sat perfectly still at the head of the long wooden table, completely swallowed by the deep shadows of the room. The flashlight beam swept past my legs, briefly illuminating the intricately carved wood of the table base, but the man holding the light kept the beam aimed low toward the floor. He did not pan up high enough to reveal my face or my upper body. They were less than 3 feet away from me. I could smell the stale cigarette smoke clinging to their clothes and the faint odor of gun oil. I could hear the heavy, controlled rhythm of their breathing in the quiet room. The scarred man was holding a dark metal pistol equipped with a long, cylindrical silencer. He held the weapon tightly against his chest, in a tactical grip, sweeping the barrel in perfect synchronization with his line of sight. They walked right past the dining table, completely ignoring the dark corners of the room. Their eyes were locked entirely on the closed wooden door of my bedroom at the far end of the hall. They firmly believed their target was sleeping soundly behind that door. They believed they were the invisible predators stalking a helpless prey, completely unaware that the prey was sitting right beside them, watching them walk straight into the jaws of a federal trap. The two men were 3 feet past my chair. Their blue tactical light was focused entirely on the heavy oak door of my bedroom at the far end of the hall. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their target was sitting directly behind them in the pitch-black room. I held a heavy crystal glass in my right hand. It contained a generous pour of my 30-year-old single malt scotch over a single cube of ice. I raised the glass to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark liquid burned pleasantly down my throat. Then I deliberately tilted the glass. The solid cube of ice slid across the crystal and hit the side of the glass with a sharp, distinct clink. The sound was incredibly small, but in the suffocating silence of the dark dining room, it sounded exactly like a gunshot. The two men froze instantly in their tracks. The scarred man spun around on his heel, bringing the silenced barrel of his pistol up toward the source of the noise. He never had the chance to pull the trigger. Before his eyes could even begin to adjust to the deep shadows, the massive crystal chandelier hanging directly above the dining table snapped on. It did not just turn on, it exploded into blinding maximum brightness. I had specifically asked Matthew to wire the main light switch to a remote detonator held by one of his agents outside. The sudden violent flood of harsh white light completely overwhelmed the highly sensitive night vision of the two hitmen. They flinched hard, throwing their free hands up to shield their severely dilated pupils from the excruciating glare. The sudden shift from total darkness to absolute illumination robbed them of their spatial awareness and their tactical advantage in a single second. I did not blink. I had been staring down at the dark mahogany table, keeping my eyes perfectly adjusted to the impending light. I sat completely relaxed at the head of the table, my hands resting casually on the polished wood. I looked up at the two contract killers who had come to end my life. They looked absolutely pathetic. They were squinting painfully through the sudden brightness, completely disoriented and completely out of position. The predator dynamic had shifted completely. The scarred man blinked rapidly, trying desperately to force his vision to clear. He aimed his weapon blindly in my general direction, trying to reassert control over a room he had already lost. He opened his mouth to shout a command, but the words died instantly in his throat. From the dark archways of the living room, the kitchen, and the main hallway, 12 heavily armed federal agents stepped silently into the blinding light. They did not shout. They did not issue dramatic warnings. They did not negotiate. They simply moved with lethal military precision, forming a perfect, inescapable tactical perimeter around the two hitmen. The only sound in the room was the terrifying mechanical chorus of 12 assault rifles chambering rounds in absolute synchronization. It was a heavy metallic clack that signaled absolute authority. Matthew stepped out from the deep shadows directly behind my chair. He was wearing his heavy tactical vest emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He held his service weapon in a two-handed grip aimed directly at the center of the scarred man's forehead. A dozen solid red laser sights cut through the bright air of the dining room, pinning themselves directly onto the chests, the throats, and the heads of the two intruders. The red dots held perfectly steady, painting a terrifying target on their bodies. The hitmen realized immediately that they had stepped into an insurmountable trap. They were expecting a sleeping civilian, and they had walked directly into a heavily fortified federal sting operation. The second man, the one who had checked Bradley's pulse in the kitchen, slowly lowered his hands. He let his tactical flashlight roll off his trembling fingers and crash onto the hardwood floor. He raised both of his empty hands high into the air, his face completely drained of color. He surrendered without speaking a single word. The scarred man, however, was a hardened criminal. His pride and his adrenaline kept his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger of his silenced pistol. He looked at the federal agents surrounding him, and then he looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure disbelief and rising panic. He could not comprehend how a frail old man had engineered a federal ambush of this magnitude in a quiet residential dining room. I placed my crystal glass down on the mahogany table. The dull thud resonated through the tense silence. I looked the scarred man dead in the eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of fear. I told him he was no longer standing in a house. I told him he was standing in the middle of a federal racketeering investigation. I explained that the $2 million wire transfer his boss was expecting tonight had just been frozen by the Cybercrimes Division. I told him the receiving accounts he used were currently being seized by the United States government, and the offshore syndicate was completely compromised. I watched the profound realization hit him. His tough exterior began to crack under the immense weight of the truth. I told him he was no longer a contract killer, executing a simple hit. He was now the primary physical evidence in a massive federal conspiracy case involving wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted murder across state lines. I pointed out the absurdity of his situation. I told him he was about to throw his life away for a $500,000 debt owed by a pathetic gambling addict who was currently passed out on the kitchen floor. I told him that if he raised his weapon even a fraction of an inch, he would never see the inside of a courtroom. He would die right here on my dining room floor, and his boss would still go to federal prison for the rest of his life based on the digital evidence we already possessed. He was completely obsolete. I gave him a choice. I told him he could drop the gun and spend the next 20 years trading information to federal prosecutors for a reduced sentence, or he could die tonight for a boss who sent him into a blind trap. I picked up my scotch and took another slow sip, never breaking eye contact. I told him he had exactly 3 seconds to decide before my son made the decision for him. The scarred man looked down at the bright red laser dots painting his chest. He looked up at Matthew's unwavering aim. The absolute psychological and physical dominance of the situation finally broke his criminal resolve. He slowly uncurled his fingers. The heavy black pistol slipped from his grip and clattered loudly onto the polished hardwood floor, sliding a few inches across the wood. He raised his hands, locking his fingers tightly behind his head, and dropped slowly to his knees in total defeat. Matthew did not hesitate for a second. He barked a single sharp command. The federal agents surged forward in perfect unison. They moved with brutal, overwhelming efficiency. They grabbed the 2 hitmen, throwing them flat onto their stomachs. The harsh metallic sound of heavy handcuffs ratcheting tightly around their wrists echoed sharply through the room. The agents rapidly searched their pockets, pulling out the $20,000 in cash that Bradley had stolen from my floor safe the night before. They tossed the banded stacks of $100 bills onto the dining table right next to my glass of scotch. The physical threat was completely neutralized in less than 2 minutes. The 2 dangerous predators who had broken into my home to execute me were now helpless prisoners lying face down on my floor. The federal agents hauled them roughly to their feet and began reading them their rights in cold, monotonous voices. Matthew lowered his weapon and engaged the safety. He let out a long, heavy breath, the tension finally leaving his broad shoulders. He walked over and stood next to my chair, looking down at the 2 arrested men being dragged toward the front door. He told them they were going to have a very long night in federal custody and that their syndicate was officially dismantled. I remained seated at the head of the table. I did not celebrate. I did not sigh in relief. The capture of the syndicate men was a massive victory, but it was not the final objective. They were merely the blunt instrument. I still had to deal with the cowardly hand that wielded it. The house was now crawling with federal agents and flashing lights, but the true architect of my attempted murder was still lying heavily sedated on the kitchen floor. The explosive payoff of the ambush had successfully secured my physical safety and dismantled the criminal syndicate. Now the only thing left to do was wait for my son-in-law to wake up and force him to look at the absolute destruction of his entire world. The heavy boots of the federal agents moving across the hardwood floor created a rhythmic vibration that traveled straight through the wooden planks and into the kitchen. The sheer volume of the commotion finally pierced the thick chemical fog of the sedative. Lying on the cold floor beneath the granite island, Bradley let out a low, ragged groan. His face was pressed against the hard wood. A thin line of drool pooled near his mouth. The potent drug had forced his body into a deep, unnatural sleep, but the explosive sounds of the raid acting like a shot of adrenaline forcefully dragged him back into consciousness. He blinked his heavy eyelids, his vision completely blurred and swimming in dark spots. His head pounded with a vicious, throbbing ache. He slowly uncurled his stiff fingers and pressed his palms flat against the floor, attempting to push his dead weight upward. His sedated brain struggled violently to piece together the sequence of events. He remembered pouring the poisoned wine. He remembered watching me drink it. He remembered the sudden, terrifying failure of his own limbs. As he clumsily grabbed the edge of the granite counter to haul himself to his knees, a sick, twisted logic formed in his mind. He heard the heavy, muffled voices and the loud shuffling of feet coming from the adjacent dining room. A groggy, arrogant smile spread across his pale, sweaty face. He genuinely believed that the noise meant the syndicate fixers had successfully broken into the house. He assumed the heavy footsteps belonged to the killers dragging my lifeless body out of the bedroom. He thought the job was completely finished. He thought he had won. He pulled himself entirely upright, his legs shaking violently under his own weight. He leaned heavily against the kitchen island, gasping for air. His expensive silk shirt was completely wrinkled and soaked with cold sweat. He wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. He needed to go into the dining room to confirm the kill. He needed to show the syndicate men that he was the boss and that the $500,000 debt was officially settled. He stumbled forward, his rubber-soled shoes dragging clumsily across the floor. He used the kitchen wall for balance, leaving a trail of sweaty handprints on the clean plaster. He moved blindly toward the bright, blinding light spilling aggressively through the wide archway of the dining room. Bradley crossed the threshold. The harsh, maximum illumination of the crystal chandelier hit his dilated pupils like a physical strike. He threw his hands up over his face, crying out in sudden pain. He stood there, swaying slightly in the entryway, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the agonizing brightness. He expected to open his eyes and see the scarred man waiting for the final payment. He expected to see my corpse wrapped in a bloody sheet. He lowered his hands slowly, blinking away the stinging tears. The blurred shapes in the room finally sharpened into absolute horrifying focus. The very first thing his brain registered was the color yellow. It was not the soft yellow of a lamp. It was the bold, reflective yellow of thick, tactical lettering printed across dark Kevlar vests. He saw 12 heavily armed men wearing federal tactical gear standing in a tight perimeter. His heart completely stopped beating in his chest. The remaining fog of the sedative evaporated instantly, replaced by a freezing rush of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked down at the floor. The two ruthless syndicate killers he had hired were not standing tall and victorious. They were kneeling on the ground, their faces pressed humiliatingly against the wood, their hands bound tightly behind their backs with thick metal handcuffs. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat completely seized up. His eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for a way to wake up from this nightmare. His gaze locked onto the polished surface of the mahogany dining table. Sitting directly under the bright lights were the 4 thick stacks of $100 bills he had stolen from my hidden floor safe. The $20,000 down payment was sitting perfectly aligned, completely out of his reach. It was no longer money. It was highly documented federal evidence of a murder-for-hire plot. Then he slowly raised his eyes to the head of the table. The ultimate realization struck him with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. He expected to see an empty chair. Instead, he saw me. I was sitting perfectly upright, entirely unharmed and completely calm. I was holding a crystal glass of single malt scotch. I was looking directly back at him with an expression of cold, absolute dominance. I did not look like a frail, easily manipulated father-in-law. I looked like the architect of his total destruction. The entire architecture of his life collapsed in a single second. Bradley looked at my calm face and then he looked back toward the kitchen. The horrifying truth finally connected in his mind. He realized that I had switched the wine glasses. He realized that I had known about the hitmen all along. He realized that the frozen wire transfer of the $2 million was not a bank error, but a deliberate federal honeypot designed specifically to trap him. Every single lie he had told, every single forgery he had signed, and every single arrogant move he had made was carefully monitored and masterfully countered. His knees completely buckled. This time, it was not the sedative pulling him to the floor. It was the sheer, crushing weight of reality. He dropped heavily to his knees in the doorway, staring blankly at the armed federal agents surrounding him. He was trapped in a cage of his own making, and I held the only key. Matthew stepped forward from the line of agents. Bradley looked up and recognized his own brother-in-law wearing a federal badge and holding a service weapon. The familial connection severed the last remaining shred of Bradley's sanity. He tried to crawl backward into the kitchen, his polished fingernails scraping pathetically against the floorboards. He shook his head violently from side to side, muttering panicked, nonsensical denials under his breath. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting extreme wealth control and superiority. Now he was reduced to a weeping, trembling mess on the floor of the house he had tried to steal. He was completely surrounded, entirely outsmarted, and facing decades in federal prison. The awakening was absolute. Bradley knelt on the hardwood floor, staring at the federal agents. His mind, still fighting the lingering effects of the sedative, desperately tried to construct a plausible lie. He looked at Matthew and then at me. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender and began to weave a frantic, disjointed story. He claimed he had no idea who those two men were. He swore they must have broken in while he was cooking dinner. He pointed to his own face, sweating and pale, and argued that they must have drugged his wine to knock him out so they could rob the house. He played the victim with a sickening desperation, his voice cracking, as he begged Matthew to believe that he had just barely survived a violent home invasion. He said he was just trying to cook a nice meal for his father-in-law. I sat at the head of the mahogany table listening to his pathetic performance. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply let him exhaust his lies until the silence in the room became unbearable. The federal agents did not move. Matthew stood perfectly still, his face an impenetrable mask of professional disgust. Bradley's voice eventually trailed off into a pathetic whimper. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate pleading hope that I might actually be foolish enough to believe him. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. I placed them flat against the polished wood of the dining table. I slid the top document slowly across the smooth surface. It stopped exactly 3 inches from Bradley's kneeling form. It was the architectural blueprint of my house, the exact same blueprint he had handed to the contract killers last night. Right next to it, I slid the second document. The durable power of attorney bearing the forged gold notary seal. I looked down at him. I kept my voice entirely flat and mathematically precise. I told him that an engineer knows how to identify a structural failure long before the building actually collapses. I pointed to the power of attorney. I told him his forgery was incredibly sloppy. I explained that he had installed a keystroke logging program on my computer, stolen my digital identity, and used it to secure a $500,000 second mortgage against my property through a shadow bank in the Cayman Islands. Bradley gasped. He recoiled from the papers as if they were burning hot. The lie about the home invasion died instantly on his lips. He stuttered, trying to formulate a defense, trying to claim he was forced into it, but I did not give him the space to breathe. The conflict chaining required me to dismantle every single escape route he had. I reached into the stack again and produced the printed wiretap transcripts. I slid them across the table. I told him we knew about the massive gambling debt. I told him we knew about the illegal sports betting syndicate. I pointed to the printed audio logs and stated that my son had been listening to his phone calls for weeks. I told him we heard him beg the syndicate boss for an extension. We heard him promise to use my death to liquidate my primary investment portfolio by Monday morning. Bradley began to shake uncontrollably. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the heavy sweat. He clutched his chest, hyperventilating. He looked at Matthew and begged for mercy, claiming he was in too deep, that they were going to kill Rachel if he did not pay them. He tried to use my daughter as a human shield to excuse his murderous greed. That was the final straw. I picked up the last piece of paper from my stack. It was the heavily redacted log from the Federal Cybercrimes Division. It detailed the exact digital footprint of the $2 million transaction he had attempted to authorize just a few hours ago. I held the paper in my hand and leaned forward in my heavy mahogany chair. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. I told him he was not a victim trying to save his wife. He was a greedy parasite trying to steal a fortune. I reminded him of the bank statement I left on my desk this afternoon. I told him that money did not exist. It was a digital honeypot designed exclusively to catch him. I watched his face contort in absolute horror as the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. He realized he had abandoned the complex mortgage plan simply because he thought he saw an easy $2 million sitting unprotected. I leaned closer. I delivered the final crushing blow with absolute certainty. I said your wire transfer did not bounce, Bradley. It went straight into federal evidence. He let out a loud, agonizing cry. It was the sound of a man watching his entire existence evaporate. I told him he had just committed felony wire fraud across state lines. I told him he had initiated the transfer using a compromised internet protocol address linking him directly to an international money laundering operation. The second he hit the send button on my computer, he had authorized his own federal indictment. I sat back in my chair. The dismantling was complete. I told him that by Monday morning, the Cayman Island lenders would attempt to execute their lien only to discover that I had transferred the entire estate into an irrevocable blind trust. I told him he owned absolutely nothing. He had no collateral, no money, and no future. I had built a financial void right beneath his feet, and he had willingly jumped headfirst into it. Bradley slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the hardwood floor. He sobbed uncontrollably, a pathetic, broken mess of a man. The sheer volume of the evidence was entirely suffocating. There was no argument he could make. There was no lawyer who could save him. He had handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped package of multiple severe felonies, and he had done it all while sitting in the comfort of my own home. I looked at my son Matthew. I gave him a single firm nod. The evidence had been laid bare. It was time for the final arrest. Matthew stepped forward and grabbed Bradley by the collar of his ruined silk shirt. He hauled him up from the hardwood floor. Bradley was completely limp, offering no physical resistance. He was a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had demanded I pay for his landscaping just 12 hours ago. Matthew spun him around and pulled his arms forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the steel handcuffs echoed off the dining room walls. It was a beautiful sound. It was the sound of a parasite being permanently removed from its host. Matthew leaned close to Bradley's ear and recited his Miranda rights. The words were delivered with the cold, mechanical precision of a federal agent entirely detached from the familial bond. Two other agents stepped in, grabbing Bradley by the arms. They began to march him out of the dining room and toward the front door. Bradley dragged his feet, his head hanging down in absolute shame. He did not look back at me. As they pulled the heavy front door open, the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles outside flooded the entryway. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the sound of crackling police radios. At that exact moment, a sharp, piercing scream shattered the remaining tension in the house. I turned toward the main staircase. My daughter Rachel was standing halfway down the steps. She was clutching the wooden banister, staring in absolute horror at the sight of her husband being shoved into the back of a black federal vehicle. She was wearing her expensive silk pajamas, the same ones I had purchased for her birthday. She looked completely bewildered, unable to comprehend the massive federal operation occupying her living room. She let go of the banister and ran down the remaining stairs. She tried to rush toward the front door, shouting Bradley's name. Two heavily armed agents immediately stepped into her path, crossing their arms to block her exit. Rachel shoved violently at their tactical vests, demanding that they let her husband go. She screamed that there had been a terrible mistake. She demanded to see a warrant. When the agents did not move a single inch, she spun around and locked her eyes on me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She marched into the dining room, her bare feet slapping loudly against the hardwood floor. She stopped directly across the mahogany table from me. She pointed an accusatory finger at my face and demanded to know what I had done. She accused me of calling the police on her husband to ruin their life. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous old man trying to destroy her marriage because I was miserable. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I looked at the woman I had raised. The emotional detachment I felt earlier in the kitchen solidified into absolute granite. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to comfort her. I looked at her with the cold, analytical gaze of an engineer inspecting a condemned building. I told her to lower her voice immediately. I stated that she was currently standing in the middle of a federal crime scene, and her screaming was completely useless. Rachel gasped, completely offended by my lack of warmth. She slammed her hand on the table and yelled that I had absolutely no right to speak to her like that. She demanded that I fix this situation right now. She ordered me to call my lawyers and bail Bradley out of jail. She still believed that she possessed the authority to make demands in my house. I picked up the forged power of attorney and the wire fraud logs from the table. I held them up so she could see the official seals and the digital timestamps. I kept my voice incredibly flat. I told her that her husband was not a successful real estate developer. I told her he was a degenerate gambling addict who owed $500,000 to an illegal sports betting syndicate. I watched her face carefully. A brief flash of confusion crossed her eyes, but her entitlement quickly swallowed it. She tried to interrupt me, but I raised my hand to stop her. I continued delivering the brutal facts. I told her that Bradley had stolen my digital identity. I explained that he had taken out a massive fraudulent mortgage against this house to pay his debts. I told her that when the syndicate demanded immediate payment, her husband had hired 2 contract killers to murder me in my sleep tonight. I pointed a steady finger toward the front door, telling her that the hitmen were already in federal custody. I stated clearly that her husband had sold my life to save his own. Rachel stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. The truth was far too massive for her greedy mind to process. Instead of showing horror at the fact that her husband had tried to orchestrate her father's assassination, her mind instinctively gravitated toward the money. She asked what was going to happen to the house. She asked what was going to happen to her inheritance. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not express a single ounce of relief that I was alive. She only cared about the financial fallout. That single question confirmed everything I needed to know. I placed the documents back onto the table. I stood up slowly from my mahogany chair. I drew myself up to my full height, towering over her. I told her she no longer had an inheritance. I explained that I had legally transferred the deed to this house and every single penny of my liquid assets into an irrevocable blind trust. I told her that the man she was currently screaming at owned absolutely nothing. I told her that she had chosen to defend a parasite over the father who had given her everything, and now she was going to reap the exact consequences of that choice. Rachel's face turned completely white. She staggered back a step, gripping the back of a dining chair for support. She whispered that I could not do that to her. She claimed that she had nowhere else to go. She reminded me that she was my daughter. I looked her dead in the eye. I told her that she stopped acting like my daughter a long time ago. I told her she was merely a tenant who had overstayed her welcome. I checked my heavy silver watch. I announced that it was currently 10 o'clock at night. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to go upstairs, pack whatever personal clothing and toiletries she could carry in 2 suitcases, and vacate the premises. Rachel began to cry loudly, but it was not the crying of a remorseful child. It was the loud, manipulative sobbing of a spoiled brat who had finally been denied a toy. She dropped to her knees and begged me to let her stay. She promised she knew nothing about Bradley's criminal activities. She pleaded with me not to throw her out onto the street in the middle of the night. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I told her that the federal agents standing in the hallway were going to escort her upstairs to monitor her packing. I told her they would make sure she did not take anything that belonged to the trust. I instructed her to leave her house keys on the kitchen counter because the locks were being changed at midnight. I turned my back on her completely. I told Matthew to start the timer. The new reality was firmly established, and there was absolutely no room in it for parasites. 8 months have passed since the night the federal agents dragged my son-in-law out of my dining room. The legal system is often described as a slow and frustrating machine. However, when that machine is fed a diet of absolute undeniable proof, it moves with devastating and unstoppable certainty. I recently sat in the back row of a highly secure federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. I sat with my posture perfectly straight. Bradley was escorted into the courtroom through a heavy side door. He was wearing a bright orange canvas jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by thick steel chains that rattled loudly with every single step he took. He looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, polished real estate developer who had casually demanded I pay for his landscaping. He looked like a cornered, starving rat. The physical toll of federal lockup had completely stripped away his false bravado. He had aged 10 years in those 8 short months. His hair was thinning rapidly, his skin was a sickly shade of gray, and his shoulders were permanently hunched in absolute defeat. The federal prosecutor did not even need to break a sweat to secure a conviction. The evidence we provided was a titanium cage with no exit. The digital logs from the federal honeypot. Account the forged power of attorney document with the fraudulent notary seal, and the sworn recorded testimony of the 2 arrested hitmen created an inescapable narrative. Bradley tried desperately to plead for leniency. He stood before the federal judge and cried openly. He blamed his severe gambling addiction. He blamed the extreme pressure of the real estate market. He even tried to blame the syndicate, claiming they had forced him to orchestrate the murder under the threat of violence against his wife. The judge was entirely unmoved by his pathetic tears. The judge looked down from the high wooden bench and stated that a gambling addiction is a sickness, but hiring contract killers to execute a family member for financial gain is a calculated evil choice. The heavy wooden gavel fell with a loud final crack. Bradley was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Bradley's conviction was only the very first domino to fall in the chain. Facing the terrifying prospect of spending the next 2 decades behind bars, he surrendered completely. He turned state's evidence and sang like a canary. He gave the federal agents every single name, every offshore routing number, and every physical drop location he had ever interacted with. The illegal sports betting syndicate that had quietly terrorized the city for over a decade was completely dismantled in a matter of weeks. The scarred man and his partner received multiple life sentences for their extensive history of contract violence. The syndicate boss was pulled from a luxury yacht in international waters and extradited back to the United States to face severe federal racketeering charges. Furthermore, the shadow banking institution in the Cayman Islands attempted to execute their fraudulent lien against my house on that following Monday morning. Exactly as Jonathan Reed had predicted, the county clerk rejected the claim instantly. The bank absorbed a massive $500,000 loss. They realized they had been completely outsmarted and immediately cut all ties with Bradley's frozen accounts. The massive financial void I had constructed swallowed my daughter completely. When Rachel walked out of my house that Friday night, with only 2 suitcases, she truly believed she could simply hire an aggressive lawyer to break my irrevocable trust. She was entirely delusional. Every single estate attorney she consulted took one look at Jonathan Reed's flawless legal architecture and immediately refused to take her case. The trust was utterly impenetrable. Because she was still legally married to Bradley, his massive financial liabilities and federal restitution orders effectively destroyed her credit score. The bank aggressively repossessed her expensive luxury sports car. All of her high-limit credit cards were permanently canceled. The lavish, comfortable lifestyle she felt so inherently entitled to evaporated overnight. She fell from the top of the social ladder straight down to the hard concrete of reality. I received a detailed update about her current living situation from Jonathan just a few weeks ago. The trust I established provides a strictly controlled living allowance, but the stipulations are exceptionally rigid by design. The funds are dispersed directly to a landlord for a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the industrial, heavily polluted side of the city. She does not receive a single dollar of liquid cash to spend on herself. To buy groceries, pay for her basic electricity, and afford everyday necessities, the woman who once demanded I completely remodel my house to her exact specifications is now forced to perform manual labor. She took a job as a cashier at a local low-income discount grocery store. She stands on her feet for 9 exhausting hours a day, wearing an unflattering polyester uniform, scanning barcodes and bagging heavy produce for minimum wage. Jonathan told me she frequently has to serve the very same wealthy country club members she used to socialize with. She finally understands the true value of a dollar, because she is finally being forced to earn one through her own sweat and profound humiliation. The world had been completely rebalanced. The parasites that had attached themselves to my life and drained my resources were surgically and permanently removed. I did not feel a single ounce of regret for the absolute destruction of their comfort. They had tried to build a beautiful paradise for themselves directly on top of my grave. Instead, they dug their own financial and legal graves while I watched them from a safe, untouchable distance. Justice is not always a natural occurrence in this world. Sometimes justice must be meticulously engineered from the ground up. Sometimes you have to let the greedy wolves walk right into your house just so you can securely lock the doors behind them and watch the entire structure collapse permanently on their heads. The morning air was crisp and completely still. I sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair on my back patio, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The sun was just beginning to rise over the tree line, casting long, peaceful shadows across the freshly cut grass. The yard was immaculate. I had hired the landscaping service myself, not to impress the neighbors, but because I finally had the time and the quiet mind to appreciate my own home. Sitting in the identical rocking chair next to me was my son Matthew. He was not wearing his heavy federal tactical vest today. He wore a simple gray hooded sweatshirt and faded blue jeans. His service weapon was locked safely in his vehicle. For the first time in 8 months, he was simply my son, and I was simply his father. We did not speak for a long time. We did not need to fill the silence with useless chatter. The silence itself was the ultimate victory. I looked at the heavy sliding glass patio door. The pane of glass that the contract killers had meticulously cut out had been professionally replaced months ago. The heavy steel deadbolt at the base of the frame was securely locked, but it no longer felt like the lock on a prison cell. It felt like a boundary. I realized in that quiet moment that true peace is rarely a natural occurrence. Peace is not something you can simply wish for, and it is certainly not something you can buy by sacrificing your own dignity to appease greedy people. Peace must be engineered. As a structural engineer, I spent 40 years of my life studying the fundamental laws of physics. I learned very early in my career that if a foundation is built on rotten wood, no amount of expensive paint or cosmetic repairs will prevent the house from eventually collapsing. You have to be willing to tear the rotten wood out completely, even if it means destroying a part of the house you loved. Bradley and Rachel were the rotten wood in the foundation of my life. I had allowed them to live under my roof out of a misguided sense of parental obligation. I had allowed their entitlement and their deceit to silently compromise my safety. When the ultimate stress test came in the form of a midnight phone call and a massive gambling debt, the structure of our family failed entirely. But I did not let them bring my roof down on top of me. I became the architect of my own survival. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. The bitter taste was deeply comforting. I looked over at Matthew. He was staring out at the rising sun, a look of profound contentment on his face. I was incredibly proud of the man he had become. He possessed the exact same unwavering moral compass that my late wife had possessed. He understood that loyalty is a two-way street, and he had risked his entire federal career to protect my life. He was the load-bearing pillar of this family. Rachel had made her choice, and now she was living with the brutal consequences of her own arrogance. I did not miss her. The space she used to occupy in my heart was not empty. It was simply swept clean. The irrevocable blind trust operates entirely in the background, exactly as Jonathan Reed promised it would. The corporate entity pays the property taxes, manages the investment portfolios, and ensures that my hard-earned wealth is completely protected from any outside interference. I am 65 years old, and I am finally living entirely on my own terms. I do not live in fear of the shadows in my own house. I do not worry about hidden debts or forged signatures. I sleep deeply every single night, knowing that the traps have been sprung, the predators have been caged, and the fortress is completely secure. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not strangers breaking through your back door. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the people sitting across from you at your own dining table, drinking your wine and demanding your resources. You must never allow your love to be weaponized against you. You must never apologize for protecting your life, your legacy, and your peace of mind. If you ever find yourself being treated as a disposable resource by the people you have supported, do not raise your voice. Do not argue. Simply adjust your strategy, build your trap, and let their own greed become their executioner. Thank you for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect must be earned and boundaries must be defended. Always remember that you have the power to engineer your own peace. I will see you in the next story.